The HOA actually sent fake officers to my house, flashing fake badges and lights, pretending they could arrest me. They thought they could scare me, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Neighbors ran out, phones filming everything, shouting at her to stop, but she didn't care. She thought she could act like a real cop, but she didn't know the person she was trying to arrest is a U.S. Marshal. This isn't a drill, and it's not a story you'll see coming. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure to hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. The HOA actually sent their own officers to my house, flashing fake badges, lights, and pretending they had the authority to arrest me. They thought they could intimidate me, but they had no idea who they were messing with. Neighbors poured out onto the street, phones recording every second, shouting at her to stop, but she didn't care. She was completely convinced she could play police. But what she didn't realize was that the person she was trying to arrest is a U.S. Marshal. This isn't a drill, and it's not a story you'll see coming. I had just returned from a long day of work, exhausted and hoping for a quiet evening. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across my quiet neighborhood. The air was calm, the kind of calm that lulls people into thinking nothing bad ever happens. I stepped onto my porch to take a deep breath and enjoy the evening breeze when a car rolled up slowly, sirens flashing, lights spinning in a way that immediately looked suspicious. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. No police car should be here at this hour. Then she stepped out. The HOA woman, clad in a suit that looked more like cosplay than authority, strutted toward my property with an air of confidence that was completely misplaced. In her hand, she waved what appeared to be a badge. The neighbors who had been tending to their gardens froze. Phones began to appear from pockets and purses, recording the scene like spectators at an unexpected street performance. "You are under arrest," she announced, her voice trying to imitate authority but failing miserably. "You have violated community rules and must come with us." I didn't flinch. I didn't move. My heart rate stayed steady. Every instinct in me screamed to stay calm, to let her make the mistakes that would expose her. My training as a U.S. Marshal kicked in. I could see the holes in her story, the inconsistency in her behavior, and the fear she was trying desperately to hide. "You need to leave," I said calmly, my voice carrying the kind of authority that comes naturally when you face danger in real life. "You have no authority here. This ends now." Her eyes narrowed. She looked like she was trying to process who I was, but it was clear she hadn't considered the possibility that I would actually call her bluff. Her fake confidence faltered slightly, but she continued to insist she had the power to arrest me. That's when I noticed her companions, 3 others who looked like they had been recruited for a weekend HOA enforcement gig. They shifted nervously from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to back her up fully. The neighbors were now completely engaged. Phones were out, cameras rolling, voices raised. "Stop! You can't do this!" one shouted. "She's not the police!" Another yelled. The HOA woman ignored them. She thought public scrutiny would intimidate me, that showing an audience would somehow give her power. She didn't know I had handled real situations far worse than this, where lives were on the line and people depended on me to act decisively. I took a step forward, slowly, deliberately, making sure my hands were visible. My calm demeanor was a tool. Intimidation doesn't always come from threats. Sometimes it comes from confidence and control. I could see her hesitation. She wanted to act, but she wasn't sure how. Her companions glanced at each other, uncertainty written all over their faces. For a brief moment, I saw the fear they were trying so hard to mask. "You are not law enforcement," I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "You are trespassing on private property, and any further attempts to intimidate me will be documented and reported. You need to leave immediately." Her mouth opened, then closed. She tried to speak again, but the words faltered under the weight of reality. Neighbors whispered to each other, pointing out inconsistencies in her story. Phones were held high, capturing every awkward step, every failed attempt at authority. She was losing control, but she didn't know it yet. I could see the shift in the energy around us. People stopped just observing and began siding with reason. One neighbor muttered, "She's bluffing. She's not real police." Another called the local authorities to confirm the situation, while others continued filming, ready to provide evidence if things escalated. The presence of witnesses was crucial. I didn't need to fight. The weight of truth and law was already working in my favor. She tried to pull out a walkie-talkie, fumbling with the device like she had never used it before. "Backup is on the way," she barked, hoping to regain authority. Her companions looked at her, panic flickering in their eyes. They were volunteers, amateurs at best, untrained and clearly out of their depth. She had counted on fear and deception to control the situation, but it was unraveling faster than she could handle. I remained calm, taking measured steps to assert dominance without aggression. Every word was deliberate, every motion calculated. I knew that in situations like this, hesitation can cost you, and overreaction can escalate things dangerously. I had faced real criminals before, people with actual intent to harm, and I knew how to read fear, weakness, and bluff. The HOA Karen's bluff was amateurish, and it was falling apart under scrutiny. Neighbors began stepping closer, emboldened by my presence. Their whispers grew louder, voices joining mine, subtly reinforcing the truth. "She's not the police! She's not allowed here!" Every phone pointed at her, recording, capturing the humiliation in real time. I could see her confidence crumble. She realized the power she thought she had was an illusion, and the illusion was melting in front of a crowd that understood what was happening. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. I calmly placed my hands on my hips, standing tall, and fixed my gaze on her. "This ends now," I said. "You leave my property immediately. If you don't, you will be held accountable for trespassing, impersonating an officer, and harassment." My words were simple, clear, and final. Her face turned red with anger, embarrassment, and disbelief all at once. She stammered, tried to say something, but nothing made sense. The neighbors were watching, phones recording, and for the first time, she realized that she had miscalculated completely. She had tried to intimidate someone who didn't rely on fear, someone whose authority couldn't be faked. For a long moment, silence filled the street. Only the faint hum of the car engine and the occasional whisper from a neighbor could be heard. Then she turned, signaling her companions, and they slowly retreated. The tension dissolved into a mix of relief, disbelief, and vindication. What was meant to be an act of power had ended as a lesson in humility and truth. I stayed on my porch, calm, collected, and vigilant. The adrenaline was fading, but the satisfaction of seeing the bluff collapse was undeniable. This first encounter had set the tone for what was to come. The HOA Karen had thought she could control the narrative, manipulate fear, and intimidate me. Instead, she had exposed herself, and the world had seen it. Neighbors lingered, offering thanks, sharing their astonishment at what had just happened. Their whispers and phones captured history in the making. The day the good guys didn't just win, they made the imposters look foolish. That evening, I reflected on what had transpired. The lesson was simple. Authority cannot be faked, and intimidation is no match for preparation, calm, and truth. The HOA Karen had tried. She had failed spectacularly, and I had ensured that justice, measured, fair, and undeniable, prevailed. And that was just the beginning. Once the fake officers had arrived and made their initial announcement, the scene on my street began to shift in ways that only heightened the tension. The HOA Karen and her companions had clearly thought they could intimidate me with their impromptu display of authority, but the moment they realized that I wasn't reacting with panic or fear, their confidence started to waver. The neighbors had emerged. From their homes, some cautiously, others with bold determination, holding phones high, documenting every second of the unfolding drama. It was clear that the entire neighborhood was now witnessing something unusual, something that blurred the line between the ridiculous and the alarming. I remained on my porch, standing tall, maintaining a calm and authoritative presence. My hands were clearly visible at my sides, my posture relaxed but commanding. I had learned long ago that true authority is demonstrated through composure, not aggression, and every word I would speak from this point forward needed to reinforce that presence. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the tension in the air settle just enough for my voice to carry clearly. "You have no authority here," I stated firmly, my gaze unwavering. "You are trespassing, and your claims of enforcement are completely illegitimate. Leave my property immediately, or you will be held accountable." Her eyes flickered with panic, though she tried to mask it with a scowl that was more theatrical than intimidating. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitation hung in the air like a heavy curtain. She had not expected the resident to respond with calm, calculated authority, and that realization caused a subtle but unmistakable tremor in her voice when she finally spoke. "You don't understand. We're just enforcing the rules," she said, her words faltering mid-sentence. She glanced at her companions, clearly expecting them to support her claim. Instead, they shifted nervously, unsure of what to do. The unity she had relied upon was crumbling, leaving her isolated and exposed. The neighbors, emboldened by my reaction, began to speak up more confidently. "She's not real police," someone shouted. "Leave now," another yelled. Phones recorded everything. I could see the fear growing in her eyes as she realized her performance was being broadcast to an audience that could not be intimidated. The power she had imagined she wielded was evaporating before her very eyes. I knew I had to continue asserting control without turning this into a confrontation that could escalate unnecessarily. Every word, every gesture, had to convey authority without aggression. I moved slightly forward, hands still visible, showing that I was unafraid and fully prepared to protect myself and my property. "You are attempting to impersonate law enforcement," I said slowly, deliberately enunciating each word. "This is a federal offense. You are trespassing on private property. Any further attempts to intimidate me or my neighbors will be documented and reported." Her lips pressed into a thin line. The three accomplices standing behind her looked increasingly uncertain. They whispered among themselves, clearly realizing that their plan had failed spectacularly. The carefully constructed illusion of authority was collapsing under the weight of truth and law. The HOA Karen tried to regain control by gesturing toward her fake badge, waving it as though it could somehow enforce obedience. I glanced at it, noting the flimsy plastic and poorly printed lettering. It was laughable if the situation weren't so potentially dangerous. The neighbors noticed it too, murmuring to each other, their confidence swelling as the reality of the situation became apparent. "I suggest you leave immediately," I continued, my voice calm but unwavering. "You have no legal grounds here. Your actions are being recorded, and law enforcement has been notified. This ends now." Her face twisted with frustration and disbelief. She was visibly shaking, trying to maintain a veneer of control, but the cracks were showing. One of her companions muttered under their breath, clearly questioning why they had agreed to participate in what was rapidly turning into a public humiliation. Another glanced at the street, noting the number of witnesses now surrounding the scene. Their hesitation only strengthened my position. The neighbors, who had initially hesitated to intervene, now moved closer, standing shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalk. Their presence reinforced my authority without me needing to raise my voice. I could see the realization dawn on the HOA Karen. She had overestimated her power. She had underestimated not only me, but the truth, the law, and the willingness of the community to witness and support justice. I watched her struggle for words, her attempts to maintain credibility failing with every passing second. "We're authorized by the HOA," she stammered. The words came out weak, lacking the conviction she had hoped to project. Her companions looked increasingly uncomfortable, some glancing down at the ground, others whispering urgently to each other. The performance she had planned so meticulously was unraveling spectacularly. I continued to maintain my calm, measured approach. "The HOA has no authority to perform arrests or detain residents," I stated firmly. "You are violating the law by impersonating law enforcement. Leave now before this escalates further. This is your only warning." The crowd of neighbors, sensing the shift in the power dynamic, began nodding, murmuring agreement, and recording the event with renewed enthusiasm. The HOA Karen's confidence deteriorated with every passing moment. The panic behind her eyes became unmistakable. She realized that the facade of authority she had relied on was no longer sustainable. She attempted to regain control by stepping closer, her voice rising slightly. You don't understand. We're just enforcing the rules," she shouted, hoping to intimidate me through volume alone. But her words rang hollow. I could see her companions exchange glances of doubt and anxiety. Their loyalty was faltering, and the audience of witnesses made any attempt at aggression a liability rather than a power play. I didn't flinch. I didn't respond with anger. Instead, I let the silence stretch, the tension palpable, letting her realize that her bluff had been called. The stillness in the air became almost tangible. Every neighbor, every phone, every recorded whisper reinforced the truth. She was powerless here, and I was in complete control. Finally, after a long, tense pause, she gestured to her companions and began to retreat, the facade of authority completely broken. The crowd of neighbors exhaled collectively, some whispering relief, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The HOA Karen and her accomplices had attempted to manipulate fear, but it had failed spectacularly. The lesson was clear: deception and intimidation are no match for truth, law, and authority. I remained on my porch, vigilant and composed. The adrenaline from the confrontation began to fade, replaced by a sense of quiet satisfaction. I had handled the situation without violence, without panic, and with absolute control. The neighbors approached, offering words of thanks and admiration, clearly relieved that the threat had been neutralized without incident. The HOA Karen's attempt to assert authority through lies and intimidation had failed utterly. Her plan had relied on fear, confusion, and deception, but each of these elements had been systematically dismantled through composure, knowledge, and truth. I had ensured that the law and the integrity of authority prevailed, and the community had witnessed it firsthand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, I reflected on the lessons of the evening. True authority is not earned through fake badges, loud voices, or deception. It is earned through knowledge, composure, and the courage to act when it matters most. The HOA Karen had learned this lesson in the most public way possible, and the neighborhood had seen the power of truth in action. By the time the HOA woman and her companions finally left the property, their attempts at control had been reduced to nothing more than an embarrassing spectacle. The witnesses, still recording and sharing their reactions, were clear that the events that had unfolded were not only unusual but remarkable. In the end, calm, knowledge, and law had triumphed over bluff, intimidation, and pretense. That night, as I closed the door behind me, I knew that this confrontation was only the beginning. The HOA Karen may have thought she could control me, but the reality of her failure had set the stage for every interaction to come. And from this moment forward, the lines between truth, authority, and deception were clearer than ever, not just for me, but for everyone who had witnessed the spectacle unfold. The moment of initial confrontation had passed, but the tension on the street did not dissipate. Instead, it began to grow, thickening in the air like a storm slowly rolling in. The HOA Karen and her so-called officers had initially relied on the element of surprise. But now that it had been lost, they attempted to regain control. Their movements were more erratic, their gestures sharper, and their voices louder, as though volume alone could make people obey. But it was clear they had underestimated the situation entirely. What they didn't realize was that escalation without authority is not power, it is exposure. I remained on my porch, calm, observant, and fully aware of every movement around me. The neighbors had gathered in increasing numbers, some stepping closer to the edge of the sidewalk while others lingered just far enough to stay safe but still capture every moment on camera. Phones were raised, whispers were exchanged, and the energy in the air shifted from uncertainty to cautious anticipation. The CR Out understood instinctively that the HOA's attempt at control had already failed, and now the scene was teetering on the edge of farce or disaster. The HOA Karen, noticing that her first approach had failed, pulled a small walkie-talkie from her pocket and began pressing buttons with a shaky, trembling hand. "Backup is on the way," she announced, her voice louder and more urgent than before. "You need to come with us immediately." Her companions, visibly nervous and unsure of their roles, glanced at each other and back at me. The uncertainty was palpable, and their collective hesitation only reinforced the realization that this was no longer a coordinated effort. I could see the thought process in their eyes: confusion, fear, and a desperate desire to regain some semblance of authority. I knew they were counting on the intimidation factor of their fake uniforms, the flashing lights, and the absurd pretense of power. But each of those tools had lost their effect. The neighborhood, acting as witness and moral compass, had already removed any leverage they thought they held. The mere act of stepping onto my property had placed them on the defensive. And now, with me firmly in control, the escalation they sought would only accelerate their own exposure. I took a step forward, deliberate and unhurried, making my presence known without aggression. Every movement was calculated to assert control while maintaining legality. "You're trespassing," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "Gee, your claim of authority is false, and any further attempt to intimidate me or my neighbors will be documented and reported to real law enforcement." My words cut through the tension like a scalpel, precise and sharp. The HOA Karen's face flushed, a mix of anger, frustration, and disbelief. She opened her mouth to argue, to assert her imagined authority once again, but her voice faltered under the weight of the moment. Her companions looked at each other, uncertainty written plainly across their faces. They had no plan beyond following her lead, and now that plan was collapsing. The more they tried to act, the more obvious it became that they were amateurs, ill-prepared, and untrained for any real confrontation. Desperate to regain control, she took a step closer, waving her badge as though it alone could compel obedience. You don't understand," she shouted, her voice quivering. We are enforcing the rules. You are under arrest." The neighbors, emboldened by my calm authority, shouted back, "She's not police. Leave now." Some stepped forward slightly, making it clear that they supported me. Phones continued recording, capturing every second of her floundering attempt to assert dominance. I knew that reacting aggressively in the moment would only escalate the situation in a way that could be misinterpreted. Instead, I maintained a composed stance, letting the tension do the work for me. The crowd, the witnesses, and the reality of law were all on my side. The HOA carry N was attempting to escalate a situation that was already out of her control. Every step she took forward only further revealed her bluff. Her companions shifted uneasily, whispering to one another, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. One of them muttered something under their breath, clearly questioning the legitimacy of the entire operation. I could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that they were participating in an act that could have serious consequences. They had believed that following her orders would give them authority by association, but now they were trapped in a spectacle that exposed their naivety. The HOA Karen, realizing that her first attempt to intimidate had failed, raised her voice even higher. "You must comply. We have authority. You cannot defy us." But the words had lost all power. The neighbors were no longer afraid. The witnesses were numerous, alert, and recording everything. Even the most casual observer could see that she had no real authority, and that any escalation would only make her position weaker. I chose to let the silence speak for me, allowing her words to hang in the air without response. Silence, after all, is one of the most powerful tools in confrontation. It forces the aggressor to recognize the futility of their position, to see that the narrative they had counted on is crumbling. The HOA Karen's companions began fidgeting, clearly aware that the performance was failing. She glanced at them repeatedly, her frustration, mounting, her control slipping further. Then came the pivotal moment. She attempted to physically approach me, thinking that proximity would somehow restore her dominance. I took a measured step back, maintaining a calm demeanor while subtly signaling that her actions were crossing boundaries. "Step back," I said clearly. "You are trespassing. You have no authority here. Leave immediately." My voice carried across the street, firm and unwavering, reaching not only her but the neighbors and everyone observing. The HOA Karen paused, taken aback by the firmness of my tone and the clarity of my stance. Her attempt to escalate the situation had been met with controlled authority and public scrutiny, and the realization seemed to dawn on her that she was now outmatched. Her companions hesitated, unsure whether to follow her lead or retreat. The tension was almost tangible, a charged energy that made every movement deliberate and fraught with risk. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. Neighbors held their breath, phones poised, capturing the unfolding drama. The HOA Karen's attempt to escalate had reached a critical juncture, and the outcome now depended entirely on her next move. Would she retreat, or would she push further and expose herself completely? I did nothing but stand firm, calm, and observant. My composure was my shield, my authority, and my strategy. I knew that escalation without substance is a dangerous gamble, and she had already proven she lacked the knowledge, training, and authority to succeed. The more she tried to force compliance, the more obvious it became that she was bluffing. Finally, after a long, intense pause, the HOA Karen signaled to her companions. Their faces showed a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and resignation. They began to retreat, slowly at first, then with increasing haste, as if the act of leaving itself was an acknowledgement of failure. The neighbors exhaled collectively, some whispering relief, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the spectacle they had witnessed. The escalation had failed. What had started as an attempt to intimidate had ended as a public display of futility. The HOA Karen had underestimated the combination of law, composure, and witness scrutiny, and her plan had collapsed entirely. The street, once charged with tension and uncertainty, slowly returned to quiet, leaving behind a clear lesson. Authority cannot be faked, intimidation cannot prevail over truth, and escalation without substance is destined to fail. As the final shadows of evening stretched across the neighborhood, I reflected on the encounter. Each move, each word had been deliberate, calculated to de-escalate while maintaining control. The HOA Karen's escalation had only highlighted the contrast between illusion and reality, between fear and authority. I had stood my ground, ensured safety, and demonstrated that calm, knowledge, and truth alwa wise prevail when confronted with deception. By the time the street returned to a semblance of normalcy, it was clear that this confrontation would be remembered, not for the faux authority of the HOA, but for the resilience and authority of someone who understood the law, the importance of calm action, and the power of truth. The tension on the street had reached a breaking point. After the initial bluff, the failed escalation, and the retreat that had seemed like a temporary surrender, the HOA Karen paused, as if trying to gather every last ounce of authority she believed she had. Her companions were visibly uncertain, whispering among themselves, glancing repeatedly at me, and checking their fake badges, as though that small piece of plastic could give them legitimacy. The neighbors remained on the sidewalk, phones raised, recording, capturing every detail of what was unfolding. They had witnessed the incompetence and the arrogance of the HOA's operation, and now the anticipation of what would happen next was almost tangible. I stayed where I was on my porch, my body relaxed but my senses fully alert. Every fiber of my being was trained to notice the slightest threat, the smallest movement, the subtle cues that could indicate danger. I observed the HOA Karen carefully, noting her posture, her hesitations, and the shifting weight of her gaze. She believed that by stepping forward, speaking louder, or acting more aggressively, she could somehow assert control. What she didn't realize was that real authority is not demonstrated through threats or bravado, but through calm confidence, legal knowledge, and the ability to read human behavior. "You are not law enforcement," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the street. "You have no authority here. Step back from my property immediately, or you will be held accountable for trespassing and impersonating an officer." My tone was calm, deliberate, and unwavering. I did not shout, but each word struck with precision, cutting through the chaos of the moment. The crowd of neighbors reacted immediately, some murmuring their agreement, others nodding, and all of them holding phones steadily, ensuring that every word and gesture would be captured. The HOA Karen's face twisted with a mixture of anger, frustration, and disbelief. Her attempts to assert authority had failed spectacularly, and she could feel the weight of her failure pressing down on her. She glanced at her companions, expecting support, only to see hesitation and fear reflected back at her. They had realized, in varying degrees, that they were participants in an operation that was unraveling with each passing second. You don't understand," she shouted, waving her badge as though it alone could compel compliance. "We have authority. You must come with us." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the inner panic she was trying to mask. The neighbors shouted back, firmly and in unison, "She's not police. Leave now. Their presence reinforce my authority," without me needing to raise my voice, demonstrating that real power is supported by law, truth, and witnesses. I took a slow, measured step down from the porch, signaling both approachability and control. My hands remained visible at my sides, not in aggression, but as a clear demonstration that I posed no threat. Yet I was prepared for any eventuality. The HOA Karen took an instinctive step back, realizing that her bluff could no longer intimidate me. Her companions shifted nervously, unsure whether to intervene or retreat further, trapped between loyalty to her and the realization that they were in over their heads. "You need to leave immediately," I said, maintaining calm authority. "Your actions are illegal. You are trespassing and impersonating law enforcement. Any further attempt to intimidate me or my neighbors will be documented, and you will face consequences." My words were deliberate and clear, leaving no room for misinterpretation. I could see the tension in her jaw, the flare of her nostrils, the quick blink of her eyes, all the micro-expressions that betrayed fear and disbelief. The crowd, sensing the shift in control, began to lean forward slightly, their phones recording, whispers of encouragement mixing with murmurs of disbelief. One neighbor muttered, "I can't believe she thought this would work." Another said quietly, "Finally, someone standing up to her." Their presence amplified my authority without a single aggressive gesture. The HOA Karen could feel it. She had misjudged not only my capacity to maintain control, but also the influence of an aware, supportive community. In a desperate attempt to regain dominance, she gestured toward the street, as if signaling that authority was somehow behind her. But there was no one. The HOA had sent no real officers. She was isolated. Her companions, who had appeared committed to her plan, now avoided eye contact, shifting weight nervously, and subtly signaling retreat. The facade she had built was collapsing under the combined weight of public scrutiny, legal reality, and my unwavering composure, I took another deliberate step forward, not to intimidate, but to reinforce boundaries. "This confrontation ends now," I said firmly. "You will leave my property immediately. Failure to do so will result in legal consequences. This is your only warning." The words were simple, unambiguous, and final. Her attempts at bluffing and manipulation had failed. She had overplayed her hand, and the momentum of control had shifted entirely. Her face was a storm of disbelief and fury. She opened her mouth to respond, attempting to speak over the neighbors, over the clarity of law, over the undeniable reality of her exposure. But her words came out jumbled and weak. The weight of public scrutiny was too much, the legitimacy she had imagined slipping away like sand through her fingers. Each second she remained, each gesture she made, only reinforced her own lack of authority in the eyes of the witnesses. Then, as if the final realization struck her, she took a hesitant step back. Her companions followed, almost instinctively, recognizing the futility of the confrontation. The street, once charged with tension and uncertainty, began to settle, leaving only the hum of the evening and the distant murmurs of neighbors who were witnessing the aftermath. The confrontation had reached its zenith, and the HOA Karen had lost completely, not through violence, not through threats, but through the natural, inevitable collapse of a bluff exposed to truth, law, and observation. I remained standing, vigilant, maintaining composure. The adrenaline from the confrontation had not yet fully faded, but my mind was already cataloging every moment, every gesture, every micro-expression as evidence of the failure of intimidation when faced with real authority. The neighbors approached cautiously, some with words of relief, some with quiet congratulations, all of them acknowledging the clear outcome. The HOA Karen and her companions finally retreated, leaving the street quiet but charged with the lessons of the encounter. Their attempt to manipulate, fear, and authority had failed spectacularly. They had overestimated their power, underestimated my training, and ignored the presence of witnesses who would testify, record, and share the reality of what had happened. The confrontation was over, and the truth had won. As I stood on my porch observing the street return to normalcy, I reflected, and the significance of the moment. Authority cannot be fabricated through intimidation, volume, or props. It is earned through knowledge, composure, and the ability to act decisively in the face of deception. The HOA Karen had learned this lesson in the most public way possible, and the neighborhood had seen the power of truth and law firsthand. In the aftermath, the energy of the street shifted from tension to relief, from fear to clarity. The neighbors had witnessed a spectacle that reinforced the principles of law, order, and moral authority. Their respect was apparent, their recordings were meticulous, and the exposure of the HOA's bluff would resonate for weeks to come. The confrontation, dramatic as it had been, had reaffirmed that truth, courage, and calm composure are far more powerful than intimidation and deceit. By the time evening settled fully, painting the street in shades of deep orange and gold, it was clear that this confrontation would not be forgotten. The HOA Karen had attempted to assert power where none existed. Her attempt to escalate, to intimidate, to manipulate had failed spectacularly. And I had stood my ground, demonstrating that authority backed by knowledge, calm, and truth cannot be challenged by falsehoods or pretense. The confrontation had ended, but the lessons remained. The street had witnessed firsthand that power without legitimacy is fragile and that bluffing authority can crumble under scrutiny. For the HOA Karen, the embarrassment was profound. For me, the victory was quiet but absolute. And for the neighborhood, the spectacle had provided a clear demonstration. When truth, law, and calm authority meet deception, deception always loses. The HOA Karen and her companions had finally retreated, but the street still buzzed with the energy of the confrontation. The neighbors lingered, whispering to one another, phones still raised, capturing every last second of the spectacle. There was a sense of disbelief and awe in the air, a collective acknowledgement that what had unfolded was not just unusual, it was extraordinary. The tension of the previous hour had been replaced by a quiet satisfaction that comes only after witnessing truth triumph over deception. I remained on my porch, standing tall, my eyes scanning the street, ensuring that the retreat was complete and that no residual threat lingered. Victory, in situations like this, is rarely instantaneous. It is earned through careful observation, precise action, and the ability to maintain control while allowing the opposition to reveal its own weaknesses. The HOA Karen had attempted to manipulate fear, to leverage authority that did not exist and to intimidate both me and the neighbors. But in doing so, she had exposed her incompetence, her arrogance, and her total lack of understanding of real law enforcement and authority. Each step she had taken, each word she had spoken, had been carefully documented, not by me, but by the vigilant eyes of the witnesses. What had surrounded the scene. I could see the expressions of relief and validation on their faces. A few neighbors approached cautiously, offering congratulations and quiet praise, their voices low but filled with admiration. "I can't believe she tried that," one muttered. "And you handled it perfectly," another said. The words were sincere, but what mattered more than verbal acknowledgement was the understanding that the spectacle had ended decisively. The HOA Karen had lost completely, and everyone watching knew it. As the crowd thinned slightly, I began walking slowly down the sidewalk, ensuring that everyone was safe and that no one else attempted to interfere. My steps were measured and calm, projecting authority without aggression, reinforcing the reality that the situation was fully under control. The neighbors continued recording, sharing footage and whispering amongst themselves, their confidence growing with each step I took. They were witnessing, in real time, the difference between real authority and imitation, between preparation and recklessness, between calm confidence and baseless bluster. The HOA Karen, now several steps back, attempted one last gesture of dominance, a raised voice, a pointed finger, a declaration that she still had authority, but it was hollow. The expression on her face revealed the mix of fury, embarrassment, and disbelief that comes from realizing your bluff has been called in the most public and humiliating way possible. Her companions mirrored her defeat, their movements hesitant, their eyes darting nervously, clearly understanding that they were complicit in a failure that would not soon be forgotten. I stopped for a moment, letting the scene settle around me. Silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of neighbors, had replaced the chaos. The threat had passed, the deception had been exposed, and the victory had been secured, not through violence, not through intimidation, but through calm composure, legal knowledge, and strategic observation. The lesson was clear: preparation, authority grounded in truth, and the ability to act decisively are far more powerful than any facade of control. I could see the relief on the neighbors' faces, the subtle nods, the whispered thank yous, and the quiet admiration that comes from witnessing someone handle a dangerous or stressful situation with skill and calm. Their presence had been crucial. They were witnesses to the truth, reinforcing the authority I projected simply by existing within the framework of law, composure, and strategy. Without them, the confrontation might have had a different tone, but with their support, the HOA Karen's pretense crumbled completely. As the minutes passed, I continued to survey the street. The HOA Karen and her team of imposters had vanished down the road, their retreat slow and awkward, marked by muttered excuses and embarrassed glances. Their exit was the final acknowledgement of defeat. The energy of the neighborhood shifted from tension to quiet celebration, an unspoken understanding that justice had prevailed, that intimidation had failed, and that deception could not withstand observation and truth. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the confrontation settle. Victory in moments like these is not measured by immediate action alone, but by the awareness that the outcome is permanent, that the bluff has been fully exposed, and that authority grounded in truth cannot be challenged by lies or threats. The HOA Karen had learned this lesson the hard way, publicly and undeniably, and the neighborhood had witnessed it firsthand. Neighbors began to disperse slowly, returning to their homes, some still whispering in disbelief, others continuing to review footage on their phones. Their recordings would serve as testimony, not only of the HOA Karen's failure, but of the power of calm, composed, and informed authority. The sense of relief was palpable. The tension that had gripped the street for over an hour was finally gone, replaced by admiration, validation, and a collective acknowledgement of what had transpired. I walked back to my porch, my steps measured, maintaining vigilance even as the threat had passed. I knew that while the immediate confrontation was over, the ramifications would ripple through the neighborhood and the HOA. Their attempt to manipulate, intimidate, and control had failed spectacularly, and the community had witnessed the triumph of law, truth, and composure over bluff and deceit. The victory was not mine alone. It belonged to the truth, to the principles of authority grounded in knowledge, and to the community that had supported it. As I settled back onto the porch, observing the quiet street bathed in the warm glow of evening, I reflected on the magnitude of the victory. The HOA Karen had attempted to assert dominance where none existed, but the exposure of her bluff, the public witness of her failure, and the unshakable authority I maintained had rendered her powerless. The neighbors had witnessed firsthand that intimidation cannot triumph over knowledge, law, and calm composure. In the aftermath, the street remained alive with whispers, murmurs of validation, and quiet expressions of gratitude. The HOA Karen and her accomplices had been removed from the equation, but the lesson lingered. False authority cannot withstand scrutiny. Bluffing power will always crumble under observation and truth. The neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson, and I had ensured that the spectacle concluded without unnecessary escalation, demonstrating the effectiveness of measured action in moments of confrontation. By the time darkness fell completely, casting long shadows across the street, it was clear that the HOA Karen's attempt to manipulate and intimidate had been fully defeated. Victory was quiet, steady, and absolute. The lesson of the evening was clear: courage, composure, and knowledge backed by truth always prevail over deception and fear. The neighbors would talk about it for weeks, replaying the event in their minds, reviewing footage, and sharing stories of the day the HOA Karen's bluff was called. And as I remained on my porch, calm, vigilant, and reflective, I knew that this victory was a turning point, not just for me, but for the entire community. My good guys had won, and the message was unmistakable. Authority cannot be faked, and intimidation cannot succeed when met with law, truth, and unwavering composure. The events of that day lingered in my mind long after the HOA Karen and her fake officers had fled the street. What had begun as a simple attempt at intimidation had evolved into a full-scale confrontation that exposed not only the weakness of bluffing authority, but also the power of calm composure, law, and truth. As the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the neighborhood, I reflected on the lessons that the confrontation had imparted, lessons that would resonate for weeks, months, and even years to come. First and foremost, I realized that authority cannot be faked. The HOA Karen had walked onto my property with badges that were nothing more than printed plastic, flashing lights meant to mimic police sirens, and a confidence that was entirely manufactured. She had assumed that the illusion of authority would compel obedience, that fear could substitute for legitimacy. But the moment her claims were scrutinized, the truth became evident. Real authority is grounded in knowledge, experience, and the law. It cannot be conjured, borrowed, or simulated. No matter how loud, confident, or aggressive someone may appear, if they lack legitimacy, their power is fragile and temporary. Second, preparation and knowledge are paramount. I had faced dangerous situations before as a U.S. Marshal, situations where lives hung in the balance and split-second decisions determined outcomes. That training allowed me to remain calm in the face of bluster and deception, to observe behavior and to calculate the appropriate response without succumbing to emotion. The HOA Karen, by contrast, was completely unprepared. She relied on volume, theatrics, and intimidation, none of which could withstand scrutiny or a measured, confident response. Her lack of preparation was evident in every misstep, every faltering word, and every awkward gesture. Witnessing her unravel reinforced the idea that preparation is a form of power far greater than any costume or prop. Third, the presence of witnesses is a critical factor in any confrontation. Throughout the encounter, neighbors had emerged from their homes, phones in hand, capturing the unfolding events in real time. Their presence amplified my authority, because the HOA Karen could not manipulate or intimidate when under observation. She had misjudged the power of public scrutiny, the social accountability that comes from having an audience, and the simple fact that people tend to support truth when it is clearly demonstrated. Witnesses not only deter inappropriate behavior, but also provide an unfiltered record of events, holding individuals accountable for their actions. In this case, they were essential in maintaining order and reinforcing the legitimacy of my stance. Fourth, calmness in the face of chaos is one of the most powerful tools a person can possess. The HOA Karen attempted to escalate, to manipulate fear, to assert dominance through loud words and aggressive gestures. Yet my calm, composed presence neutralized her attempts. Remaining steady, observing carefully, and responding deliberately sent a clear message. Authority does not need to shout, intimidate, or threaten. It speaks through action, presence, and unwavering confidence. Chaos may provoke fear in some, but it also reveals who is in control. Maintaining composure is the key to demonstrating real power because it communicates both confidence and capability simultaneously. Fifth, legal knowledge and the understanding of boundaries are indispensable. The HOA Karen's attempts at arrest and intimidation were not only fraudulent, they were illegal. She lacked the authority to perform any enforcement action, and her efforts to act beyond her scope exposed her to potential legal consequences. Knowing one's rights, understanding what is permissible under the law, and being able to communicate that clearly and calmly are invaluable tools in any confrontation. They serve as both shield and sword, protecting oneself from illegitimate authority while reinforcing the legitimacy of one's own actions. In this encounter, the clear delineation between legitimate authority and pretense was the decisive factor. Another lesson became clear as I reflected on the reactions of my neighbors. Community awareness and engagement can be a powerful deterrent to abuse and deception. The HOA Karen had assumed that her intimidation tactics would isolate me, that fear would prevent anyone from intervening. She had not counted on the support of a vigilant, observant community willing to stand by truth and record injustice. Their presence ensured accountability, prevented escalation, and demonstrated the strength that comes from collective observation. Communities that remain passive in the face of intimidation allow deception to flourish. Communities that act, even subtly, empower justice. Equally important was the realization that overconfidence and arrogance are often a person's undoing. The HOA Karen had believed that her props, her confidence, and her theatrics would suffice to coerce compliance. She underestimated the importance of competence, preparation, and situational awareness. Every misstep she made, every hesitation, every faltered word revealed her lack of understanding and her overestimation of her power. Confidence without substance is fragile. Arrogance without competence is dangerous only to the person who exhibits it. Her failure was a lesson in humility for anyone observing. True authority is earned, not assumed, and it is proven through action, knowledge, and adherence to law. Furthermore, the encounter reinforced the power of patience. At no point did I rush, yell, or act impulsively. Each response was measured, each step calculated. I allowed her actions to reveal their weaknesses naturally, letting her escalate only to the point that her bluff was fully exposed. Impulsive reactions may escalate conflict unnecessarily, but patience allows the truth to unfold on its own, revealing the character and legitimacy of each party. By exercising patience, the situation was resolved. Without violence, without unnecessary confrontation, and with clear and undeniable authority established, the aftermath of the confrontation was equally instructive. The HOA Karen and her companions had retreated, but the ripple effects remained. Their actions had been documented, their authority exposed as false, and their reputation diminished. The community had witnessed firsthand the collapse of pretense in the face of truth and composure. Meanwhile, the residents had gained a first-hand lesson in standing firm, documenting injustice, and supporting the principles of law. The encounter became a teaching moment, reinforcing the importance of vigilance, knowledge, and calm action in the face of intimidation. As the street returned to normal, the glow of the evening fading into night, I reflected on the broader significance of the day. Every element of the confrontation, preparation, composure, knowledge, legal awareness, the presence of witnesses, had combined to ensure a decisive and peaceful resolution. The HOA Karen had learned, in the most public way possible, that deception and intimidation cannot overcome truth and legitimate authority. The neighbors had learned that vigilance, observation, and community engagement are vital tools for maintaining order and accountability. And I had confirmed, once again, that the principles of law, composure, and truth are far more powerful than any facade of power. Ultimately, the day was a lesson in resilience, vigilance, and the nature of true authority. False power crumbles under scrutiny, intimidation falters under observation and preparation, calmness and knowledge prevail every time. The HOA Karen had attempted to manipulate, deceive, and control, but her efforts were futile against truth and law. Victory had been achieved, not through force, but through intelligence, composure, and integrity. In the quiet aftermath, I walked through the neighborhood, speaking briefly with neighbors, answering questions, and providing guidance on how to handle similar situations. I encouraged documentation, calm response, and legal awareness, reinforcing the lessons of the day. The residents absorbed the guidance eagerly, understanding that knowledge, calm, and preparation are the best defenses against deception and intimidation. By the end of the evening, as darkness settled fully and the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm, the impact of the confrontation was clear. The HOA Karen had been exposed, her bluff fully revealed, and the residents had witnessed the triumph of truth, law, and composure over deception, intimidation, and arrogance. The lessons of the day were etched into memory. Authority must be earned, courage must be measured, and calm and preparation are the ultimate tools of success. The street was quiet now, but the story lingered, a lasting reminder that good always prevails when it is backed by knowledge, truth, and composure. The HOA Karen had been defeated, not through violence or shouting, but through the quiet, steady application of law, observation, and patience. And that, above all else, was the most important lesson learned from the confrontation.